Well, welcome to Dairy Livestream. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, managing editor of Hoards Dairyman. We're broadcasting from the Cheese Cave here at our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson at the historic W.D. Hoard & Sons company that was commissioned by our Wisconsin Governor W.D. Hoard. So what might be dairy's legislative priorities? That's the topic at hand, and we'll expand it to all of agriculture here. And that's the question on the minds of many on this inauguration day, and right about now when Joe Biden will be sworn in as the 46th president of the United States, with President Biden now leading the country in both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate controlled by the Democrats. Dairy and all of agricultural priorities might have shifted some since we last talked on Dairy Livestream about this topic on December 2nd. As you hear from our panelists today, again, please submit your questions. I'd remind our audience to ask questions early to ensure we have time to ask your question during our hour-long webcast. With that, our producer will go ahead, Caitlin will go ahead and put our first poll question up. And I just asked these questions so that we get a framework for today's conversation. What is the balance of the U.S. Senate? 60 Republicans, 40 Democrats, 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats, 60 Democrats, or 40 Republicans, or none of the above. So go ahead and answer that question. We're getting a resounding answer on it. So we can go ahead and cut that poll off. And the answer is indeed 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats. Our first Dairy Livestream panelists will shed some light as to the potential opportunities of passing legislation in the next 2 years. David Carlin has been examining and providing strategic perspective on dairy markets for nearly 4 decades. The Kansas dairy farm boy eventually earned his law degree from Harvard University. Later, he served as Assistant Secretary for Congressional Relations under President Bill Clinton. After working nearly 26 years in the private sector as a lawyer for a public law and policy firm, Dave Carlin returned to his dairy roots by joining the International Dairy Foods Association as the Senior Vice President of Legislative Affairs and Economic Policy. Dave, the political landscape got more interesting since our last conversation when the Senate runoff in Georgia went to the Democrats for both seats. How does that impact dairy and agricultural policy work in the Senate? Dave?
Well, thank you, Corey. It's a pleasure to join you and Paul and Andy again today to talk about what's going on in Washington. And as always, there is a lot to discuss. And to your question about the sort of composition of the Senate going forward, we do have an interesting situation where we have at least caucusing together 50 Democrats, 48 Democrats and 2 independents and 50 Republicans as of a few minutes ago. With Vice President now Harris breaking the tie in the Senate. We've had this happen before. This is not a unique situation in our country's history. And most recently that happened in 2001. And the way the Republicans and Democrats worked things out then was to have even ratios on the committees, so the same number of Republicans and Democrats, with the understanding that if a bill that was being considered by the committee received a tie vote, then it was going to advance or be eligible to be advanced to the floor. And also the understanding was because in this case, the Democrats will have the extra vote of the vice president to break any ties, they'll control the Senate floor calendar. So that's probably where we're going to end up, I would suspect, but we're not there yet. The majority and minority leaders met yesterday when their old roles were still in place, and that's going to change this afternoon officially. But they haven't come up with a final agreement yet. So where we are right now, Corey, is sort of in limbo. Nothing can really happen in the Senate without 100 votes, 100 people not objecting to a proposal to move something forward. And that's going to make it a little challenging, particularly on the Ag Committee, where we have a retiring Republican who's left the committee, Pat Roberts, and an ability to sort of move forward and reconstitute under the incoming chairwoman, Debbie Stabenow, who will be returning to that role. So the new majority leader, Chuck Schumer from New York, has said he has 3 priorities for the Senate for the coming days. Number 1, got to figure out when and how to hold an impeachment trial for President Trump. That's still very much on the agenda for the Democrats. Number 2, confirming President Biden's cabinet nominations and other appointees who require Senate confirmation. That's going to require a lot of committee work at the Ag Committee and other parts of the Senate. And finally, work on a COVID relief package to complement the one that Congress passed and the President signed at the end of December. That was viewed by Democrats, at least, as a down payment, as a starting point for further action that the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress want to take to pass further legislation on the COVID relief front, which will likely include a lot of the incoming president's new priorities about access to PPE and vaccines, and a nationwide plan in those areas, improved testing, additional money for stimulus checks in state and federal government. So there's going to be a lot of discussion about that package as well. Now, in terms of the Ag Committee itself, I'm going to have the opportunity to talk to both the incoming chairwoman, Debbie Stabenow, and the new ranking Republican of the committee, John Bozeman, next week at Dairy Forum. So if you haven't, shameless plug, if you haven't registered for Dairy Forum, this is you're not too late. We can still take your registrations, and we'll be chatting with both those senators next Tuesday. So please join us for that. You hear directly from them about where they're going to be taking the committee. But I think in addition to holding confirmation hearings, which is going to be a big part of what they do once the Senate is able to organize, I think they're going to be also focusing on a number of initiatives that are, again, being championed by the Biden administration. One of those will be climate change. And I think the positive role that rural America can play in combating global warming. For too long, I think we in the rural community have viewed climate change as something we need to be scared of, as something we need to be worried about. And it was going to affect in a negative way how we operate our farms or our ranches and our other operations. And I think the new administration has a vision where rural America can take a leading role in a positive campaign that will help rural America, I think, continue the good work it's already doing. And I can speak for our industry on the processing side. I know Paul's got similar success stories on the farming side. Dairy has done a good job here. We can continue to lead on this issue, whether it's in a carbon bank or, it's similar to paying farmers to put more carbon back into the soil. We've got a good story to tell here. I think the Ag Committee under Chairwoman Stabenow's leadership is going to focus on this. So that's an issue that I think will be front and center for the committee early on. Another issue that we'll probably see again is child nutrition reauthorization, something that Paul and I, with our two organizations, have worked closely on for the past several years. Because child nutrition reauthorization is something that should have happened a few years ago. These programs include the school meals program, the women, infant, and children's feeding program, and other meals programs that affect vulnerable populations haven't been reauthorized by Congress for some time now. And they're overdue for that review and then reauthorization. And there are some opportunities there for dairy in terms of expanding potentially some of the milk options that are available in the WIC program, some of the flexibilities for yogurt and other products that are also in that program, and for preserving our ability to continue to serve 1% flavored milk in schools. That's something that Paul and I, have worked very hard on for the last few years, and we're in a very vulnerable period right now because of some court cases and recent activities at the department. So we're going to need to really focus on child nutrition reauthorization to lock that ability in, or otherwise we'll find ourselves back to serving fat-free skim milk, flavored milk at schools. And that's not something any of us want to see, because we know that kids don't like the taste of that product and they don't drink it. And we lose an entire generation of milk drinkers if we're not able to at least get them to have 1% flavor. We can't do more than that because of the dietary guidelines. That's something we're going to have to work on in 5 years, but at least we got to protect that with the new administration. Trade is another issue, and I know Corey's going to talk about this a little later, so I won't spend much time on it, but it's so important for the dairy industry. 15% of our product goes overseas, and we're going to have 33 billion more pounds of milk between now and 2028. Where is that milk going to go if it's not going to go overseas to overseas markets? So we're going to have to look for opportunities in new markets, expanding existing markets. And in order to do that, we're going to have to probably pass a trade promotion authority bill at some point here when we get serious about trade. It's not at the top of the administration's list of things to do, but TPA reauthorization is something that we're all going to need to work on together as an industry and across the food and ag sector. And in particular, in terms of existing agreements, we're very focused, and I know Paul's group and USDEC is as well, on holding Canada's feet to the fire in terms of their implementation obligations under the USMCA. making sure they administer their tariff rate quota program in a fair way for U.S. Milk, and also making sure that they don't do anything on milk class pricing that is violation of that agreement. So we're going to be very closely working with USDA and USTR on that front. Finally, a preparation for the next farm bill is something the Senate Ag Committee is also going to be engaging on. That's a few years away, 2023, 2024, but it's time now probably to start holding hearings at the congressional level, and certainly in the Senate Ag Committee, to hear from stakeholders like Dairy about what's working in the current farm bill and what isn't. And we're certainly going to be focused in that process about preserving risk management options for all classes of milk, whether it be by forward contracting or other means. And secondly, expanding the Healthy Fluid Milk Incentives Project program that we were able to insert in the last farm bill from a pilot program to a nationwide program. And why is that important? It's important because it puts milk in the good for you food category, just like fruits and vegetables, where we belong. And if we can take that from a pilot program, which is designed to encourage SNAP families to drink more fluid milk, and put it nationwide, it's going to provide more nutritious, access to more nutritious fluid milk products to SNAP families than they currently have. And that's our hope, is that we can really grow that program in the next farm bill. And finally, and I'll close here, COVID relief, I mentioned it earlier, as a focus area for the Senate as a whole, but of course the Senate Ag Committee will play an important role in putting the next bill together. We're going to be focused on implementing the recourse loan program that was included in the last COVID relief package that's designed to help dairy processors who have been providing food to restaurants and food service a way to capitalize their inventories, to provide working capital to allow them to continue to operate through the duration of this pandemic. And finally, working to implement the new dairy donation program that was also included in the last. So there's a lot more to talk about. I'm looking forward to engaging with Paul and Andy on these topics, and I'll turn it back over to Corey, and look forward to answering your questions later in the webcast.
Well, thank you, Dave. And I want to come back real quick to the Dairy Forum that Dave talked about. It's certainly one of the industry events I've enjoyed going to for a number of years now, and it's one of the places I get quite a few material for the magazine and ideas to follow up on. So this year's Dairy Forum for the first time will be a virtual experience, and you can just Google it or go to the IDFA website to get more details. So with that, let's go to our next poll question before we hear from Paul. What is the balance of the U.S. House of Representatives here? And my numbers are that I had of the day we wrote the poll: 221 Republicans and 211 Democrats, 216 Republicans and 216 Democrats. The third option there is 221 Democrats and 211 Republicans, or none of the above. So go ahead and answer that poll question here. I know a number of you watch our video, but some of us turn it into a podcast or audio only mode. If you're doing that, you cannot vote. So Jim or Caitlin, when you're comfortable, we can cut that poll question off. And 85% of our viewers got the balance right here, that it's 221 Democrats, 211 Republicans. That may have changed, and Paul can correct me, but it's real close to that. And our next guest is Paul Bleiberg, who started his Washington career as a legislative correspondent for House of Representative Sherman Behart and legislative assistant to the House Representative Randy Keel, of both a pair of New York State Republicans. Paul then became chief of staff and legislative director for House Representative Reed Ribble, Republican from Wisconsin. In 2016, Paul joined the National Milk Producers Federation and now serves as Senior Vice President of Government Relations. Paul, both the House of Representatives and U.S. Senate are now operating with a slight majority in favor of Democrats. In fact, the Democratic majority I read was the slimmest one since 1945. That's dating back to the close of World War II. How will that shape the next 2 years, Paul?
Well, first, thanks, Corey, for the opportunity to be here and to be here with Dave and Andy as well. Looking forward to the discussion we'll have. This is the second most closely divided House we've had in modern history. Actually, at the same time when we had the 50-50 Senate configuration in play that Dave referenced during the 107th Congress, we had a very closely divided Republican majority in the House in 2001 and 2002. in the first 2 years of George W. Bush's presidency. Now we're going to have a very similarly closely divided House. Right now, it does stand at 221 to 211. There are 3 vacancies. 2 of them are in Louisiana, one on account of a Democratic congressman resigning to serve in the Biden administration, the other on account of a Republican candidate passing away before swearing in on account of COVID-19. So the governor there will announce 2 special elections to fill those 2 seats. There will be a couple of other vacancies that come open as a couple of House Democrats move over to the administration. The 3rd vacancy continues to exist in my congressional district where I'm from, New York 22. The process there, the court process is coming to an end this Friday, but there could be subsequent rounds of litigation and recounts and things like that. So we don't really know when we'll have a member there. The House is not bound by the same procedural constraints as the Senate, which is to say, whichever party controls the House can, for the most part, do whatever it wants when it wants to, if they have the votes. Now, with only 221 and maybe eventually one more, one less, give or take, it may be challenging for Democrats to find that kind of consensus. Just to give you a couple of numbers, there are 7 House Democrats in districts won by President Trump just this last go around. And there are 6 House Democrats that are part of what they call the squad, which is sort of the leftmost flank of the caucus. And so in order to get the needed votes to pass a bill through the chamber, Speaker Pelosi and her leadership team will have to satisfy at least some members in both of those 2 flanks. And there are other members both in the center of the caucus and on the left end of the caucus that will align with and associate with those smaller groups as well, making them a little larger and dictating where the leverage points are. But most of the action in the House on a day-to-day basis is really in the majority party. If you're in the House minority, you really only have say, so depending on what committee we're talking about and depending on what kinds of bipartisan negotiations are playing out. But I think in a lot of ways, the Senate will have to drive that. Maybe not the case for the House Ag Committee. The House Ag Committee has largely proven that even in times of one-party government, the committee does operate in, for the most part, a fairly bipartisan manner. I think we can expect to see that continue with the committee's new leaders. Both of their leaders are new, unlike the Senate. David Scott from the Atlanta suburbs and part of Atlanta, the city, has taken over as chairman of the committee, and G.T. Thompson from Central Pennsylvania, North Central Pennsylvania, has taken over as the ranking member. And the 2 of them, they both served on the committee for a long time together, and I think have gotten to know each other a bit. I think they're going to have some shared priorities. One of those, I think, is going to be in the climate space. Dave touched on this a little bit, but from our perspective, National Milk has been very active in this space for quite a while. Almost a year ago now, National Milk and several other industry organizations launched the Net Zero Initiative, which is a voluntary effort to get our carbon footprint across the board to net zero by 2050. That doesn't mean every single farm will get there. Some farms will get there well before, but it's a 2-pronged effort, both focusing on carbon emissions and on water quality issues. In tandem with that, National Milk is part of the steering committee of the Food and Ag Climate Alliance, which is an coalition launched a couple of months ago, a mix of farm organizations and environmental conservation groups working together on both legislative and administrative options where we may be able to make some progress with USDA, with other agencies, and certainly with the Congress. And just like Senator Stabenow on the Senate side has taken a large interest in climate issues, so have both Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Thompson on the House Ag Committee. They've indicated a strong interest in holding early hearings in that space. Both staffs have people on the teams that are well equipped on this topic, and so I think we'll look forward to working with them, educating all of them and their new members, because both sides will have some new members on the importance of that topic, and really making sure that the Ag Committee can play a good role there in climate legislation. Back in 2009, the last time Congress seriously considered legislation in this space, both House Ag Committee Democrats and Senate Ag Committee Democrats were really active in the negotiations in their respective chambers, trying to make some headway there, especially Senator Stabenow. So that's going to be a major topic. Now, child nutrition does not fall under the jurisdiction of the House Ag Committee. However, both Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Thompson have been very supportive of many of our priorities there in the dairy industry, as far as securing the gain on low-fat flavored milk and making other progress as well. So even though we do have champions in both parties that serve on the House Education and Labor Committee, actually including Mr. Thompson also, the Ag Committee has a lot of members that are going to be engaged in this space, and we'll certainly be looking to keep them partnered. A third area for the committee is trade. Dave talked about this a little bit, but more and more people consuming dairy being outside of the U.S.'s borders, that space becomes more and more important to us. And in addition to working on Trade Promotion Authority, hopefully, I think we are going to be working, as Dave talked about a little bit, we've been partnering very closely with Congress on making sure that the U.S. Trade Representative holds Canada's feet to the fire on implementation of their dairy commitments on USMCA. We were able to get a quarter of the House and a quarter of the Senate to put significant pressure on USTR and USDA under the now former administration, given the change that happened 20 minutes ago. And they did announce an initial enforcement action in December that was hailed by both Democrats and Republicans. And so I think we are very optimistic about Catherine Tai, the U.S. Trade Representative nominee. And I think we're looking forward to working with her and her team. And she's been a partner for many years on these issues. So we're excited there. A couple of other issues I want to touch on that aren't going to be in the House Ag Committee's direct purview, but where the committee does tend to weigh in. Another major priority for us is ag labor. In December of 2019, the House made progress in passing a bipartisan bill called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. And that bill essentially did two things that we really care about in the dairy industry. It reformed the H-2A guest worker program so that dairy and other year-round sectors could use it. And it provided a more stable legal status for our current workforce, which obviously is very, very significant for us on the dairy producer side. While that's an issue for the House Judiciary Committee, then Chairman Peterson and some other members of the House Ag Committee were very, very active behind the scenes in helping that bill move forward. Many of the members that are champions on that issue serve on the Ag Committee, so surely it's a space where they will be staying engaged. And then, of course, the Farm Bill process, which is in the Ag Committee space. As Dave said, it doesn't start right away. But I would imagine maybe certainly next year, once we are able to work through some of the COVID issues this year, and maybe some of the climate issues, they will be holding hearings. They'll be talking to stakeholders. I think from where we sit, we're going to be wanting to make sure that the dairy margin coverage program is working as well as it can work. Certainly the margin protection program from a number of years ago needed a significant overhaul in order to be an effective safety net. We were able to accomplish that in the 2018 Farm Bill and in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 over the course of that year. I think we're hopeful that we don't need to do that kind of a wholesale rewrite of the program. I think it is a better program now, but there's room for improvement around the edges, especially as it relates to the production history calculation. That's a great example that hasn't been updated. In the COVID relief package that was signed into law in December, we were able to get a provision in there that'll make many producers eligible for supplemental dairy margin coverage payments based on production history increases. And the way that provision is structured is it expires right when the Farm Bill expires, and Congress wrote it carefully to have that absorbed into the baseline. So it will make our job a little bit easier there. And in the interim, we are looking at the Class 1 mover again, certainly within the National Milk Membership and Economic Policy Committee in particular, given the challenges wrought by the pandemic last year. And, certainly we'll be talking with Dave's organization, trying to figure out, is there a path forward there that can maybe solve some of the problems that last year brought to light. Until a lot of that legislative work kicks up, we are going to be focused on implementing the COVID-19 package. We worked very hard on the dairy donation program that was included. We were very glad that was there, and certainly are hopeful that will help us move more product into the hands of food insecure households where it needs to go, especially as we really continue for the next several months in the pandemic. Obviously, we have a certain degree of a light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccine, but that distribution process hasn't gone as quickly as I think a lot of folks would have liked. I think one of the priorities for the Biden administration in this new COVID bill is a much more robust vaccine distribution setup. So I think that's very heartening to see, and hopefully that gets done. So Corey, with that, I'll stop there, and then with the right time, happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, Paul. And I hope our audience appreciates the energy that both Dave and Paul are bringing to this conversation. There is a lot on the plate for this coming year in 2021 when it happens to work in Washington, D.C. So we're going to go to our final poll question here, and Caitlin will put that up. If reappointed by the Senate, or reconfirmed, I should really say, by the Senate, Secretary Tom Vilsack will become what? The first USDA secretary to serve under 2 U.S. presidents, the longest serving USDA secretary, the second longest serving USDA secretary, or none of the above. So go ahead and answer that question here. And I'd like to remind our audience to go ahead and submit questions here. Once we hear from Andy, we will open that up for questions. And so let's go ahead. We're approaching the 50% part here. And actually, the answer to this one is the second longest serving USDA secretary. There's been a number of secretaries served for under 2 presidents. Certainly if a president died in office, that would have taken place here. So if Secretary Vilsack serves out his term, he'll be the second longest serving one, USDA secretary. A gentleman named James Wilson, another Iowan, was the longest serving USDA secretary at 16 years and was the only one to serve for 3 US presidents. Those presidents all happen to be Republicans. Andy, welcome back to Dairy Livestream. You definitely know a thing or two about dairy politics, dairy policies, and overall ag policy. And in the 1990s, you were had an appointment with the House Ag Committee and worked closely with Congress on a number of dairy initiatives. And you've had several appointments with USDA's Office of the Chief Economist, too. And throughout the years, you've worked on projects like the Milk Diversion Program, the Dairy Termination Program, Federal Order Reform, which may come up someday in the future here, and the Dairy Margin Protection Program. Andy, we're in store for probably pretty 2 unique years coming up for all of agriculture. What's your take?
Well, thank you. And yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting. And we've all thought of that and kind of wondering how it all plays out. Dave kind of leaned a little bit towards focusing on the Senate, and Paul leaned a little towards focusing on the House. I'm going to try to focus a little bit more on USDA. And as you mentioned, of course, Tom Vilsack is scheduled to come back in and reprise his role as Secretary of Agriculture. For those of you who were checking the served under 2 presidents boxes, you can take some solace in the fact that Tom is the only recycled Secretary of Agriculture. And in fact, that doesn't happen very often in the cabinet. And it'll be your trivia question to figure out which United States president was actually recycled, served 2 terms, but had somebody else in between. Keep in mind, everybody is always saying, "Oh, so what's he going to do? And does that start like at 4 o'clock this afternoon, or do we have to wait till tomorrow morning?" Well, this guy hasn't been confirmed yet, and there's going to be a whole bunch of confirmation hearings. There are, I don't know, something like 9,000 high-level political appointments, not all of which, by a long shot, not all of which require a Senate confirmation. But the number of people that require Senate confirmation, which is a pretty formal deal, it's not just that, what do you think? How about donuts on Tuesday? It's a little more involved than that, is daunting. And you'll recall, when was it, guys? Sonny Perdue didn't get confirmed. The last major cabinet appointment was the end of April or something. I'm pretty confident Tom Vilsack will be appointed before the end of the month, but he's not moving in yet. The other thing that, and by the way, there's about a dozen positions in USDA that require Senate confirmation. So he's got to get his team together too. Frankly, Tom hasn't really confided in me, but I'm not sure if he's got those all figured out yet. But it's going to take a little while to get that team in place. Furthermore, when Sonny Perdue came in, he reorganized a fair bit of the structure. The basic ground level agencies, that didn't change. But he created a different structure at the top and kind of moved some boxes around, and let's put these guys with those, and let's put this one over here. One of the big controversies was his idea of moving rural development outside of some undersecretary box and having that person report directly to Sonny Perdue. People who felt very strongly about rural development thought that was kind of a demotion of that area. He argued quite to the contrary. But in any case, the point is there's likely to be some reorganization, which affects how many undersecretaries you're going to appoint and who's going to report to them. And I think this could get connected with his agenda. He has been quoted as identifying 6 or 8 areas that are going to be particularly important to him. Rural development is one of them. Environmental related issues is very much at the top of his list. He is, I've got it kind of written down in my notes as a competition agenda. That isn't his words, but He's interested in the structure of agriculture and in the structure of the industries that serve agriculture, the agribusinesses that sell things to farmers, the processors that buy things from farmers. He's interested in, are people getting a fair shake? Are farmers getting a fair shake? He's mentioned large meat packers as perhaps having a more influence on what happens in the beef industry than we might all agree is appropriate. He's mentioned this from the standpoint of employment and the worker safety issues for folks working in the meatpacking industry, which, as I think all of us know, was hit pretty hard with COVID. There really isn't a place in USDA that has a kind of a competition thing. The Economic Research Service has done some kind of sort of quasi-academic studies, but this is all to the point of how is he going to get himself organized to achieve his agenda. One area that I think everybody in agriculture would agree is hugely important, we talk about it all the time, it's going to be the subject of at least one or two live streams very soon, is labor. That's obviously something that Tom Vilsack is concerned about, but there's really no jurisdiction for USDA in that area. So I don't think that that's going to be part of his structure, but other areas that he's mentioned are reflected. He's not in charge of a lot of these things, but will be reflected. Rural development, I think, is going to have two pieces to it. One is going to be a technology piece, and one is going to be sort of an economic and community vibrancy piece. And Paul, or certainly Dave, but Paul may want to comment on this too, as I think this could be especially compatible with the new House Ag Committee. I think Chairman Scott and Ranking Minority Member Thompson are going to really resonate with the idea of investing in rural communities. G.T. Thompson lives in kind of the Scranton area, which, oh, by the way, was Joe Biden's hometown. It's not a super prosperous part of Pennsylvania. It's not, huge farms and green acres everywhere. And they think a lot about what can we do to bring economic vitality. And Scott is going to have a similar perspective, although he's from the Atlanta area, which has certainly got plenty of economic opportunity. He's going to be really concerned about underserved populations. It's going to align very well with Mr. Vilsack's interest in underserved communities, minority communities, and so on. So that could be a pretty big ground common agreement. Rural broadband is a great example of technology investment. That has really come to the forefront as everybody's trying to Zoom all over the place and so on. One of the things, and again, I'd certainly invite Paul and Dave to, if they've got insights on this, but one of the things that Tom has indicated that he's really keen on is building resilience, which really sounds great. It kind of sounds like, Andy, you need to lose like 10 or 15 pounds. I agree, but how am I doing that exactly? And probably easier for me to lose 10 to 15 pounds, but what the build resilience agenda is going to be, I'm not so sure. But when he's pushed on this, he kind of talks about local economies and building local networks and smaller scale farms. And so that's going to be an interesting one to see where that sorts out. Another thing that he's already come out and said is, hey, I'm not going to be shy about spending money where I have some discretionary control. Now, again, keep in mind, he can't just go spend money on whatever he feels like, but there are some pots of money that have kind of general purpose. And Secretary Perdue certainly took advantage of those pots of money in creating the Farm to Family Food Box Program and the CFAP direct payments. And Tom Vilsack is going to have the same authority to spend that kind of money. I think what we will see with Secretary Vilsack is not, here's a check, happy to have you, hope we can help out a little bit. It's probably going to be money that's more tied to incentivize some other kind of purpose or program. The environmental thing is an obvious one. He can't just fabricate a whole bunch of environmental programs out of thin air, but he can authorize kind of experimental demonstrations, small scale projects. he's got enough money that he could say, well, let's go try this thing in some part of Iowa and another thing in some part of Georgia and another thing in some part of Idaho, and see if it works. And I think he's got an ambition to try out some ideas that possibly will be informative when we get to a bigger legislative season, Farm Bill or otherwise, to say, oh yeah, we tried this thing and that worked, or we tried that thing and it didn't work. So I think he will be open to supporting agriculture, but probably with more strings attached, not just here's a check, go and do whatever you want. The other thing that we're going to see a very stark difference in, I think, across the administration is a much more leadership by the scientific community. And I think one of the things that Secretary Vilsack is hoping to do is to use the pretty darn considerable resources of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which includes the Agricultural Research Service and the Economic Research Service, the Office of the Chief Scientist, and a whole bunch of very well-trained, bright people, to bolster the science and create some kind of templates that could inform how other people think agriculture ought to be regulated, because we don't get to write that rule book all on our own. And so I think he's going to try to get ahead of the curve to create an argument that can be seen as having scientific integrity that other people, including international groups or third-party agencies, might want to bring to the forefront when they start thinking about regenerative agriculture and so on. So those are at least some of my ideas, Corey, about what I think will be the focus. Does that mean the Secretary of Agriculture hasn't really given a lot of thought to negative PPDs? Well, yeah, actually, I kind of think he hasn't. But somebody else will, and that's really the job of the International Dairy Foods Association, or more specifically, National Milk, to say, here are some of the smaller things that we want to bring to the forefront, and we thought them through, and here are some of our ideas, and he'll react to those as they come to his desk, but he's not going to lead with that.
Well, thank you, Andy. We're going to go straight to a viewer question here because it dovetails into a number of things that I know Paul and Andy have spoken to here, and Dave too, for that matter, because that's when the question came in. The question is, how will that good story about environmental stewardship on farms translate into money and revenue opportunities for farmers? Now, there's a number of ways we can go about answering that question. There'll be pilot projects. I mean, way back in 1986, my dad was one of the first ones to put in a manure system to store and make better use of fertilizer, and that was an incentive program that we had. It was a demonstration farm. So there's those ways of things, but then there's the overall bigger picture of stewardship or sustainability, what that would mean and how that turns into revenue opportunities for farmers. Who wants to tackle that one first?
I can make a few comments to start. It may depend on the form that legislation takes, but it could be incentive payments, whether that be, for sequestering carbon in the soil, or for, implementing certain practices on land, or adopting certain kinds of technologies. It could be tax credits. There's a lot of discussion around doing tax legislation. Carbon tax comes into the conversation on climate, so that could certainly be in the mix. We've been pushing at National Milk on some tax credit legislation for a while that would better incentivize the use of certain nutrient separation technologies and digesters by covering some of the upfront capital costs. And then obviously in the Farm Bill conversation down the road, there could be talk about enhancing conservation programs to make them better incentivize certain kinds of behavior. So I think it kind of depends on maybe the structure of legislation we're talking about, Farm Bill versus tax bill. If there's a climate package, there'll probably be a lot of committees, including Ag, that'll have their hands in the pot. When Congress was working on the cap and trade proposal 12 years ago, what the Ag committees were really trying to do was make sure that Ag could get credit for offsets there, and that USDA would play a role. That was a very specific proposal at the time. I don't know that would play in here. We're not talking about cap and trade, but environmental markets are obviously becoming more and more relevant here. There's good legislation in the House and Senate that would pull back some of the barriers to participation in those. That's in the Ag committees in both cases and could be looked at as part of a package. So I think there are a number of different kind of tools in the toolbox here, and some of it will depend on whether or not we're talking about a bipartisan piece of legislation or something done by Democrats only under the reconciliation bill, and what form that kind of a package would take. But there are a lot of different solutions that I think we'll be ready with, no matter what the sort of table is, how the table is set, so to speak, because there are a lot of members, Democratic and Republican, that serve on the ag committees, especially, that want to do more, not just to recognize what's already being done on the ground, but maybe to create some revenue streams for more work.
Corey, when I think about this, it strikes me there's three things, and we have to remember the first two before we jump to the third. One is, what's the problem? Okay, for example, cows burp methane. It's not a debate. We're not disputing that fact, but we can ask ourselves, okay, in what way is that a problem? We have gained a lot of ground in terms of science-based understanding of to what degree is this an issue, just looking at it from the standpoint of the dairy farm, but also to what degree is this an issue in terms of climate change or any other sort of environmental effect. So we're still working on that. There's still people that make it a bigger deal than it probably is, but that's one part, is just agreeing what is the problem. The second part is agreeing what fixed looks like. So, okay, I have a problem. I want to be better. What's my goal? What am I trying to get to, and how fast? That's a big conversation. It's really important. And, there's a whole group of folks out there saying sooner than, we're already too late. And other folks saying, oh my gosh, we got to slow down because this is going to be hard work. The next part is how are we going to do it? And that invariably involves some combination of carrots and sticks. And it also gets to, if I'm going to be hit with a stick, is this justified? Is this, I'm really that kind of a bad guy. When you talk about carrots, you always have the issue of the group of folks that already did it, and they didn't get paid to do it. And then the groups that are getting paid to do it, and because they waited around long enough. And at the end of the day, I think David and Paul would be the first to agree, there is just no way any of this is going to happen that's going to make everybody happy. But I think we just have to kind of plow through that process and try to do our best to manage it.
Dave, let's turn the conversation to trade. We've had a lot of different philosophies on trade here over this journey. But what do you think the future holds for trade under the Biden administration? Specifically, will we see a more tariff approach or a more alliance approach?
I think on that very question, more alliance approach is where we're headed. Although I think that the incoming administration has said that they're going to maintain the tariffs on China. I think our focus as an organization is, as I said at the outset, expanding trade opportunities for our industry, whether it means better access in current markets, such as Japan and China, whether it means improving our access to markets like the EU and India, and making sure that we've got a home for that significant percentage of dairy products we produce that needs a home. I mean, we're reaching the point now, and I think our listeners probably know this already, where we're going to be exporting more milk than is utilized in Class 1. And that would have been something that would have been unthinkable just 20 or 30 years ago. So we've definitely got a focus on this issue. We've got to work with USTR and USDA going forward to find homes and maintain access, whether it means rejoining a multilateral agreement like the TPP that President Trump pulled us out of, or again, focusing on individual markets. My concern is, and I understand this from a political standpoint, is that the new administration is not going to try to really tackle trade issues for the first, 9, 12 months of the administration. It's not at the top of the agenda. I know there's a lot of good reasons why that is. There's obviously COVID, there's other things at home we've got to worry about. And one of the things as an industry we're going to have to do is continue to push the new administration to focus on trade opportunities and to make sure that we re-engage, because every day that we don't, we fall further behind our competitors in the global marketplace. So this will be a top line issue for us looking forward.
Paul, anything to add there?
No, I largely agree with Dave. I think we are going to see a shift toward multilateral agreements versus bilaterals once the administration begins contemplating the trade policy. The area where it might be a little unclear is China, because the party lines don't cut across as clearly on that one in some cases. But I think broadly speaking, we'll see a return to the traditions of, frankly, most presidents in both parties that were more reliant on multilaterals. And I agree with Dave that we'll certainly be having to push the administration and also work with Congress to try to elevate the importance of new agreements, but also implementation of existing ones.
Let's turn to a next question here. And Paul, you've spent a lot of energy on that. WOTUS, or Waters of the United States, have been a hot topic for the past two administrations. Do you think the issue has been put to rest when it comes to defining what a navigable waterway is here, or will that topic pop up again?
No, I don't. And actually, I'll add 3 administrations. This really started in the George Bush 2 administration on a kind of a court ruling in 2006, a Supreme Court 441 ruling on account of Justice Kennedy there. And, the problem here is the underlying law, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, is not being viewed the same by all sides and by all stakeholders. And as a result of this court ruling, from now 15 years ago, the successive administrations have tried to put their stamp on clarifying this policy. The Bush administration did it, the Obama administration did it, the Trump administration did it. Each time this happened, some group of stakeholders didn't like it. And so it got overturned, and then the new administration did it, then it got overturned again, and then the next one did it. And this is going to keep happening, frankly. I hate to give people that information, but this is not going to be resolved until Congress says, okay, this law is now almost 50 years old. It needs to be more fundamentally reauthorized, and some of these questions need to be settled legislatively. And so while many in agriculture liked the rule that the most recent administration put out, that rule is going to probably be, it may not be withdrawn immediately because it's been on the books for a little longer, but that rule is going to be reworked by the new administration, I'm sure. I would think. I don't know anything for sure, I would imagine. And then the next administration will rework it again. That's the unfortunate nature of Congress not doing its job so often and kind of abdicating responsibility when it really needs to exercise it, is you have the executive branch and the judicial branch do this tango on a lot of different things, and nothing really gets solved because the underlying statute hasn't been touched in God knows how many decades. So I don't have optimism on that issue from the standpoint of it being resolved. I think this will go on and on and on until Congress, on a bipartisan basis, says enough, we have to deal with this ourselves.
Andy, let's go to this next question here, and I'm sure that some of our other panelists will want to weigh in on it. And I want to remind our viewers, our next program is going to be on ag labor, so we're getting quite a few questions on that. But since we're on Inauguration Day, immigration reform and a workforce for all of agriculture has been a topic of minds of many dairy farmers. According to Monday's Washington Post, President Biden will roll out a sweeping overhaul of the nation's immigration laws with an 8-year pathway plan. Now, we don't know all the details. That's linguistics at this point. But what might be in store?
Well, excellent question. I'm hardly an expert or know all the details, but there's always a question. Okay, what is the administration going to propose, and what is the United States Congress, both parts, are going to approve? And the United States Senate is going to be a pretty big governor on, like in a car, on just what can happen. So I think we got to let that process play out, and what the president proposes isn't hardly the final deal. I think most folks in agriculture would agree that coming up with some sort of normalization of an agricultural workforce has never really been all that heavy. We could figure out ways to do that. But the thing that's always been a sticking point has been the pathway to citizenship argument, and what do you do with the people that are already living here, even though they might have undocumented status? And I think that's the part that's going to be complicated for Congress to work through. I think a lot of Americans have sympathy for children that were brought here as young people, babies even, and have lived here all their life and probably don't even speak their native language, their parents' native language that well. and all those sorts of things, but it still is just a tough issue. I'm concerned, as we've seen before, that solutions to ag labor are going to get bogged down by these pathways to citizenship discussions. And what do we do with the so-called dreamers and the people that are already here? And so I think the road is a little rocky, but I think the car is on that road and it's going to proceed down it. And we'll have to see what the will of Congress is going to be ultimately.
Paul, I'm sure you want to weigh in on that, and I'm going to ask a follow-up question for you to consider too that came in from a viewer, and we'll talk about this on February 3rd's Dairy live stream. Continuing with immigration and labor, how do you view the national minimum wage potential proposal at $15 per hour, and will overtime be forced on ag labor?
Well, I don't have a lot to say there, unfortunately. I want to be careful. But I'll say on ag labor, as Andy was talking about, I think one of the challenges on immigration in general is the political imperatives on both sides of the aisle that make this issue very hard to get done. One of the things I sometimes say is that for every single issue, there's sort of a pendulum and it swings back and forth, either favoring taking action and solving an issue or kind of not taking action and leaving it alive as a political issue. And unfortunately on immigration, it seems that very often that pendulum is on the side of not acting because one party, or in a lot of cases both, and they just perceive it differently, both parties see a lot of political benefit from not having the immigration issues at large, not specific to ag, but overall, get resolved. So, you're going to need a certain amount of compromise. I think it's possible that there'll be an opportunity here. Obviously, Biden is sending up a bill to Congress for them to consider. And I think from there, we will sort of see them put their stamp on that and, make decisions about what they want to move forward. But there's a lot of complicated questions about DACA. There's questions about how Republicans are going to want to engage on this issue in the wake of Trump and all of the attention he brought to the issue. On the minimum wage proposal, I'm not sure how that'll play out. There are certain things that we might have talked about this earlier that can be done in the Senate using the budget reconciliation process, which is a way to avoid the 60-vote requirement. My understanding from people is that minimum wage is maybe not one of those things, which would mean that you would need 10 Republican senators at least to be voting for something that would have that policy in there. So off the bat, I'm not sure how probable it is that something like that will get enacted. And different things are going on in different states. But for now, I think the jury would be a little bit out, for me at least, as sort of seeing where that issue goes, because I don't think it'll be able to be included in something that can move really fast. But obviously, as part of trade-offs, you never know.
Yeah, Corey, let me just interject very quickly. This is an issue that we are very focused on as well, both on the farm side for our co-op members, but also on the plant side, at manufacturing plants, where we have trouble attracting workers consistently for at least certain positions, and we have sometimes equipment breakdowns that we can't repair locally that require somebody coming in from overseas, and that's been very difficult under the current immigration laws. So we've been working a lot with the agriculture groups, but also with the manufacturing side to try to figure out a path forward to take some of the friction out of the current system and make it easier for our industry to operate in the in the different circumstances. Right, we're not seasonal. We're 7 days a week, and so that's what's made it difficult. And I think there's a lot of understanding of that up on the Hill. But again, like Andy and Paul said, the path forward is rocky.
I have a number of topics here that people want to talk about yet, but one came in and I'm going to try to answer that. And I'm going to ask Andy if I need any correction on it. My answer, it's very short. The question is, will the milk pricing system change to reflect the farmer's cost of production? My simple answer is it's doubtful that Congress will take a position that ties cost of production for any agricultural commodity and hitch it to pay price. Anything to add there, Andy?
I don't see that happening.
Yep. Let's we talked a little bit about technology in rural America, and we're going to go quick. We're going to go quick in our pace here. President Biden has been quoted saying we should be spending $20 billion with a B to put broadband across the board. What might that actually mean for rural America, who has not been having a great deal of success in some instances connecting during this pandemic. Anyone want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I'll make a few comments. I don't think there's any debate that improving broadband access in rural areas is both necessary and worthy. That's just not the question. The question is, oh my gosh, can we afford it? And, it doesn't take any genius to figure out it's a hell of a lot easier wiring up New York City than it is to wire up, Manhattan, Kansas, or someplace 75 miles from Manhattan, Kansas. And so the question is always, how do we get started? What do we do? Well, there's a couple things going on here. One is USDA's first broadband subsidy program was initiated in 2002, which is getting towards 20 years ago. And it demonstrated if you spend enough money, you can create the infrastructure in a rural area. But it also made it very clear that if you're going to scale this up to the United States of America, it's going to cost a pretty penny. People talk about the Rural Electric Association. They talk about co-ops and what they could do. And all of that's great, but it still keeps boiling down to it's a ton of money. The other thing is technology. I mean, imagine there's more people on the phone than just me who can remember, dialing up the internet using your landline telephone. Well, now, the big buzz is that Elon Musk is going to put a whole bunch of Teslas around the planet. And we're all going to be able to connect to his new satellite system. Tesla's not what he's going to put up there, but the idea is that we're going to just do that, and it's going to be in the sky. We don't even need wires. Unfortunately, that's not quite there yet either. So you've got this racing intersection between what we can do technologically and how much it costs. And I think as we look at that, there's going to be this, if we wait till this, it'll be cheaper, and then we don't have to put up all these wires. We just, put up antennas. And so I don't know. It's going to be a bit of a struggle, but I believe that there is a lot more political will, especially when you've got two guys sitting in the House Ag Committee that are going to be pushing for it, and a guy that's sitting in the Jamie Whitten building who's going to be pushing for it as well.
Paul, this has been an issue that has been slow going. It's also technology related. Might there be movement on using RFID or radio frequency identification on cattle under the new administration? Now, Derry's been a pretty big adopter of it. Our cousins in the beef sector, not so much so.
It's possible. We'll have to do a little more checking on that issue for sure. But, I think it'll depend on what personnel are in place there and also what kind of pressure the new administration will get from the Hill, because cattle issues, especially in the last, year, 9-10 months, especially when it comes to marketing and pricing in that space, have really taken up a lot of oxygen on the Hill, and I think will probably continue to. So I'm not sure where this will exactly fit in, but I think it'll depend on some of those conversations.
Dave, a lot of people, especially in the food processing sector and reaching out to consumers, may have, in the news lately, we talked about the animal biotechnology regulator framework, and we're talking about genetically modified organisms and those kinds of things. Not necessarily GMOs, but within animal transfer. Say you want to insert a gene for polled cattle into the greater population in the Holstein breed or a Jersey. They talked about in the previous administration under President Trump moving that from the Food and Drug Administration to USDA, kind of doing it through executive orders and rulemaking. Is that really going to happen, or is that just probably going to get reversed under this administration?
I don't know this. I know the status of it. I don't know what the likely outcome is. I do know that USDA was able to get an executive order signed, at least at the department, but the FDA commissioner never signed his copy of that order. He's been arguing against giving up that jurisdiction to USDA on Twitter and other social media. So, and that was as of just this morning. So the fate of that is probably not. I wouldn't project that to be something that's going to last very long, particularly if the Biden administration doesn't see the benefit of that. That was something that was being, pressed more on the USDA side as opposed to FDA, and if I had to guess right now, I'd say that that's something that could easily be reversed by the new administration.
Well, thank you, Dave. That's all the time we have for questions here. I'd like to invite our viewers to mark their calendars for February 3rd, 2021 at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time. Our topic will be what's the future for ag labor, and we're going to talk about this at the national level. We're going to talk about this at the state level for some major dairy states here. There is a lot at play. We got immigration, we got wages, and all those kinds of associated topics. So go ahead and mark your calendar. We have our guests secured for that. You're going to enjoy them. And on behalf of our guests today on this inauguration day, I'd like to thank Dave Carlin, Paul Bleiberg, and Andy Novakovic for being with us. I hope you all have a great day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.